In the Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Messmer's Flame build. This is a build that combines a Fire Knight Ash of War with Fire Knight's Greatsword, and also uses a couple of the Messmer Flame spells from the DLC. This was one that was voted on pretty heavily when we did our poll of next builds to see. It came in second, so let's get into it a little bit. So first things first, let's talk about the Fire Knight's Greatsword. This is actually a colossal sword despite its name. It has very, very high attack rating. It's infusible. So what we've done here is we've put the Flame Spear Ash of War on it, and we've set it to the Flame Art Infusion. And what this has done is it's made the fire damage of this weapon about 2-to-1 to the physical damage. So it has a lot of fire damage on it. It has fantastic Faith scaling, and this allows us to crank Faith in order to cast Messmer's Flame spells effectively, and also use buffs like Golden Vow and Flame Granting Strength. And the Flame Spear Ash of War is not bad, in my opinion. It has pretty decent range. You can charge it up for extra damage. When you hit with both the weapon and the projectile, it does even more damage. Has significant stance damage in my testing. I'd say it's somewhere between 30 to 40 stance damage if you hit with the weapon itself and the projectile. So you do get stance breaks with this as well. And it also buffs the weapon for 40 seconds for 95 extra fire damage, so you're going to have that on top of it. Meaning you want to try and get one of these off every so often in fights, in order to keep buffing your weapon. So then in my offhand, I'm using the Fire Knight Seal, and this is really good because it boosts Messmer's Flame Incantations by 15%, and the two damaging spells that we're using in this build are both Messmer's Flame Incantations, so they're going to get bonus damage from that. When you compare it to like the Erdtree Seal when you have very high Faith, it really isn't that far behind it. You could actually cast with the Erdtree Seal in your right hand while holding this in your left hand to get a bit more damage if you're talking about min-maxing. However, what I find is that I like being able to hold this in my offhand and have my sword in my right hand so I can use the weapon skill or attack or cast spells without having to swap back and forth. And because the incantation scaling is only a little bit lower, it doesn't matter to me that much. So for spells for this build, we have Golden Vow, obviously, to boost attack and defense, including our spells, weapon attacks, weapon skills. We have Flame Grant Me Strength, which is short duration, which is nice for boss fights, though, because it boosts fire and physical damage. So this is going to apply to our spells, our weapon attacks, our weapon skill, everything, so it's good to have here as well. The two new spells we're using are Fire Serpent and Messmer's Orb. Messmer's Orb is obtainable from defeating Messmer the Impaler and then exchanging his remembrance at the Round Table Hold. Now, Fire Serpent is really good. You can charge this for extra damage, or you can kind of spam it for very high damage. Either one works really well for this build. And I would say if you're like methodically picking off enemies on the landscape, you'll probably want to charge it up each time that you can to try and conserve FP. But when you're in boss fights and bosses have a lot of pressure on you, it's really hard to charge this up each time. So you'll probably just end up spamming it most of the time during boss fights, but nonetheless, it's still really good. And one of the things I really like about Fire Serpent 2 is it gives us a spell that we can use on horseback, and the thing about this is it has really, really good tracking. You'll notice this in our footage. When you're on horseback, like, it doesn't really matter which direction you're pointed when you cast this, it's still going to track the target. Really, all you need to learn to do is get good spacing between you and the target so that it doesn't fly past them. But if you can, like, ride directly away from your target and throw it up, it'll fly behind your head and attack the target. Not many spells, if any, will do that, so it's really, really good for something like that, and I highly recommend using this on horseback if you like fighting on horseback, or you find yourself in a situation where you're not confident getting close to an enemy when you can be on horseback. So then we come to Messmer's Orb, and Messmer's Orb is just fantastic in my opinion. What it does is it raises you into the air before you kind of charge down and detonate a fiery explosion, not unlike what Messmer does during his boss fight. You can charge this for extra damage, and you'll hang in the air longer when you do this, but you do not have hyper armor when you're, using this spell. So it's not like you can just withstand all these attacks and it'll detonate. Like, you have to time it properly, and you have to have decent poise on your character, so if you do get hit like once, it doesn't knock you out of this. And I like using this spell as an AoE when there are lots of enemies. It's a great way to just get rid of a lot of enemies quickly. You can body some bosses because it knocks enemies down when it hits them most of the time. So you can just keep chaining this to just keep bullying them around. And also you can use it to jump over attacks instead of jumping, like if you're facing Rolana, for instance, or maybe you're fighting Romina. You can jump over some of her centipede attacks with it and then punish her for damage. And if you get really good with this spell, there's a lot of utility to that jump if you can learn to time it properly. That's not something I excelled at with the time that I spent putting this build together, but I imagine if you play this build regularly, you'd get that down. Now, Rain of Fire is the other Messmer's Flame spell. We don't use it here because a couple reasons. First of all, its damage is pitiful. It's really, really bad. And secondly, it's really hard to hit a target. If you cast this on anything that moves more than an inch, it's going to walk right out of the AoE area of this, and you won't hit them for damage. So even if the damage was increased on this spell, it would still be very difficult to land, and you can charge it for extra damage. I find that most of the time the damage doesn't matter anyway, and it's even harder to land it if an enemy is moving towards you while casting it while you charge it. So for armor for this build, we have Messmer's Helm, and then we have rest of the pieces, the Fire Knight armor set. Messmer's Helm not only increases Messmer's Flame Incantations by 3%, but also Fire Knight skills by 8%, so you're going to get kind of a double dip out of this one. You could also use the Winged Serpent Helm if you want to further increase Fire Knight skill damage by 10%, which would apply to our weapon skill, but not our spells. But since I was kind of trying to find the balance between Fire Knight skills and Fire Knight spells in this build, I decided to use Messmer's Helm instead. And the Fire Knight armor chest piece also increases Fire Knight incantation damage by 5%. So you're getting incantation damage to Messmer's flame spells from the chest, from the helm, and from your Sacred Seal. So all those are buffing the damage of those two spells. Now the problem with this armor setup is that you're not over 51 poise, or you're not at 51 poise natively. So you'll have to either do what I did and use the Bullgoat's Talisman to get there to kind of keep the fashion, which takes up a valuable talisman slot, and there are a lot of good talismans for this build. Or you would have to use, some other gauntlet and legs that will get you over 51 poise, or to 51 poise natively, because you really want that poise when you're using Messmer's Orb and when you're using your weapon skill so that you're not interrupted and you can complete those. So I'm not completely min-maxed here because I've sacrificed a talisman slot for fashion, but who cares? So other talismans that I use that are kind of my go-to for this build are Fire Scorpion Charm and Shard of Alexander. I almost never unequip these two. Fire Scorpion Charm is going to boost the damage of a lot of your weapon attack because it's predominantly fire damage. It'll boost both of your spells. It'll boost your weapon skill damage. It will make it so you take increased damage, but I think it's worth it in this case because of how much fire damage you deal. And Shard of Alexander is going to further boost the weapon skill damage, and it does a lot of damage, so this one is really good to have. Beyond this, Godfrey Icon is not bad because you can charge up your weapon skill and you can charge both of these spells, so if you find yourself doing that, which I do a lot in this build, you can use that as well. Flock's Canvas Talisman is also not a bad choice. This further boosts incantation damage, and sometimes I will swap this out with Godfrey Icon if I find that I can't charge my spells in a particular boss fight, and I find myself spamming them instead, so that's also an option. And Crusade Insignia is not a bad option out on the landscape. You'd probably swap this out for Shard of Alexander if you're killing enemies with spells regularly, or even just regular melee attacks and you're finding that you're not using your weapon skill as much out on the landscape. So that one you could sub in as well. And then for attributes for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 30 Mind, 25 Endurance, 22 Strength, 18 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 74 Faith, and 9 Arcane at level 165. You don't need any Intelligence or Arcane for this build. Vigor is a bit lower than what I would like it to be, but because we're already at level 165, I haven't put points here. But you'll eventually want to get this to 60. Mind is at 30, and I think this is the minimum you'll probably want for this build, because you use Golden Vow, you use your spells, you use your weapon skill, you use all of these things regularly, you need lots of FP, so you'll probably want to take this up to 35 or 38 later on. Endurance is at 25 just to be able to medium roll with what we're using. You could get more, but it's not super necessary. Strength is at 22 in order to use this weapon one-handed. I find that if I can use the Sacred Seal in one hand and one hand the sword in the other, then I can cast or attack. I like that. If you don't mind just two-handing the weapon, you could drop this down to 15 strength. 18 dexterity is needed for the weapon requirements, and 74 faith is obviously because we're using the Flame Art Infusion. We want to get hard-hitting incantations, so we have as much faith as we can get. Eventually, you'll take this up to 80 and probably eventually higher as well. And then when it comes to Flask of Wondrous Physique, we have the Flame Shroud and Crack tier. This is here because we have so much fire damage with this spell. The spells deal fire damage, the weapon is mostly fire damage, the weapon skills a lot of fire damage. The theme of this build is fire, so no brainer there. And then we have a new one, the Oil Soaked tier. This makes it so it debuffs enemies to take increased fire damage, not unlike oil pots when they remain near you. So your melee attacks, your weapon skill, if you use Messmer's Orb and you're close enough, it's also going to debuff and then will increase your fire damage. This is good on a build that's close to enemies. If you're far away from them and just casting fire spells at range all the time, you're not going to get a lot out of it. But if you're playing a melee build that does a lot of fire damage like this one, you're going to get a lot out of it. And honestly, this probably should have been in my Fire Knight Impaler build as well, but I frankly did not know about it at the time. So this is a really good one to have, and highly recommend slotting in that build as well if you're using that. And if you're talking about what great runes to use for this build, there's two that I'd recommend. Radahn's is good. Stamina, FB, health are all good for this build. Or you could use Godric's. You are using 6 of the 8 stats. So you do need a good amount of attributes for this build, and that can help alleviate it a lot. So that wraps up my Messmer's Flame build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This was a ton of fun to put together. Really enjoy this weapon. The Fire Knight's Greatsword is absolutely fantastic. It's kind of a weird moveset, but once you learn it, it's not bad at all. And as always, if you have questions or tips, please leave them in the comments, and I will try and get to them as soon as I can.